Well, greetings, class. Today we're going to be looking at the argument by Patrick Lee and Robert George as presented in their article entitled The Wrong of Abortion. What they do is present a position that argues for the immorality of abortion. That is, they are arguing that abortion is morally wrong. It is not morally permissible. And the reasons they actually give for that and the positive argument that they give is fairly simple. And what we'll do is we will look at that argument first off, uh, and then after that, what they do is they give a exposition of various pro-abortion arguments, and they respond to those arguments with criticisms, showing why they're not persuaded that those arguments really have any merit. So before we get into the arguments, we should ask the question, who is Patrick Lee and who is Robert George? I think it's fair to say that they're very important moral philosophers, very important ethicists um, in the English-speaking world. For several years, Patrick Lee has been at the Franciscan University at Steubenville, Ohio. For many years, Robert George has been a professor of philosophy. Or actually, that's wrong. Actually, he's a professor of political theory at Princeton University. And just recently, he's also taken a joint appointment at Harvard Law School. So I really don't know how that works, but he has a full-time job at both places, at Princeton and at Harvard. So he's a busy guy. Both of them are confessionally Roman Catholic. They're both pro-life. And again, their position is that abortion is objectively moral. Now, interestingly enough, they don't appeal to any religious or theological tenets in order to argue for that. Um, what they actually appeal to, you might argue, is science or medicine or some basic concepts in human embryology. And what are these basic concepts that they appeal to? Well, they say that if you were to take any sort of basic embryology textbook, even something basic for high schoolers or for undergrads, what you would find are some important, really just as they put it, scientific factual aspects about embryology that themselves on their own would suggest that that the fetus indeed has the status of human personhood that is very um, that is very important for right having the status that would mean that one has the rights and um, the privilege of not being killed, if we just want to sort of put it that way. So what does human embryology tell us? Let's look at some of these points specifically. They argue that what human embryology tells us is that from the point of fertilization, an embryo is distinct from any cell of the mother or father. All right, so let's step back a little bit and try to think about uh, this part in the process in terms of a pregnancy, of the creation of this thing that eventually um, could mature and become a fetus, and then could be born and become um, a born person, if we want to put it that way. So I guess we all understand the process, or I hope you understand the process that's happening as terms of what human fertilization is. I'm not going to try to explain it to you right now. Maybe if you don't know what that is, go ask somebody. I would suggest to Google it, but then I'm thinking, no, you better not Google it. You might end up finding more than you bargained for if you do that. But the point here is that upon human sexual intercourse, when uh, the eggs of the female are fertilized by the sperm of the male, what happens is that the point of impact, frankly, begins what we call fertilization. The zygote is formed, and over time, the zygote becomes an embryo. Okay, and the embryo is this entity that indeed will become the fetus, will become the child, will become the person over time, if allowed to do so. And what we know, or at least what embryology tells us, is that the embryo itself, okay, is distinct from, how would I put this, from that embryo's father's contribution to the process, and it's distinct from its mother's contribution to the process. It indeed is its own individual entity. Okay, that's the point. Now, we're not saying, uh, Lee and George are not saying then that at this point you have to agree that that's a person or anything like that. All they're saying is that this is a distinct entity. Whatever it is, it's its own thing at that point. Secondly, its growth is internally directed. Now, what do they mean by this? I think basically the idea is that, given that we've already established that this embryo is a distinct entity all on its own, um, at the same time, it already has the programming within itself to direct its development, to direct its growth, to direct its maturity. And by this, we're talking about its physical maturity, its physical growth, its physical development, right? It's not as though the brain of the mother is controlling how the embryo grows, um, nor is anything outside of it controlling that growth. You might argue, well, but it's still dependent upon the mother that it's in for shelter, for nutrition, for all these kinds of things, for the environment in which it uh, could uh, could grow and develop and mature. And fair enough, that's the point. And I think what Lee and George are going to say is, and the same could actually be said about you as well. As a full-grown human being, an adult human being, that your shelter, your context or environment for maturity and for growth and for sustenance, right? All of that indicates that you are dependent upon other people and other things for that, um, at a particular level of abstraction, or to a particular degree of dependence, I should say. So anyway, that's just the basic point here, is that nothing is controlling its maturity except itself. Point number three, it's human. And that seems pretty obvious, right? I mean, here we're just talking about the particular species of which this embryo is. If we're talking about a human embryo, then this embryo is human. This embryo is pre-programmed with everything it needs to grow up, to mature, to develop, and it's a specifically human kind of thing that is doing this. Point number four, then, it is a complete organism, though immature. Now, this is really the sort of crux of the argument that they're trying to present here about 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 the personhood status of the embryo. When they say it's a complete organism, they're not saying that it's fully developed, right? That's the point they're making after the comma. It's immature. But it's complete in the sense that so long as it has nutrition and shelter and an environment that is conducive for it to mature, it will do so. It is complete in the sense that it has everything it needs on its own to do all of this. Again, you might say, yeah, but it's so dependent upon the mother for its life. And again, Lee and George are going to say, well, that would be the case for everybody. We are all dependent upon other things for our lives, dependent on the houses we live in, or the nutrition that we get from the farmers that grow our food, um, or so on and so forth. Um, you might even say that, to an extent, though it's immature, that even that might say something about all of us as well, that there is more maturing, more developing for us in the future as well as it would be for this fetus, and that we're just kind of all on a different stage of development as far as that goes. So unless then you really throw a wrench into the process in a sense, that is, and you prevent this organism, this embryo, from fully developing, um, if you just leave it alone, it's already fully programmed to do what it's going to do and to develop itself into maturity, into becoming more mature and more mature and more mature and more developed and more developed and more developed until death, whenever that might be. So it's going to grow and it's going to mature and it's going to reach development as it is programmed to do, internally programmed to do, without being controlled or programmed or manipulated by any outside force. So what does all this have to say about embryos then? Well, for Robert, George, and Patrick Lee, as they claim, really then what embryos are, given these 4 points that embryology tells us, is that they are human persons just simply at an earlier stage of development. That's all they really are. They are not unique in any sort of ontological or metaphysical way. They are not all that different from the rest of us, if who are, say, full-grown adults. They are simply entities that are human persons that, on the scale of maturity, are at an earlier point on that scale, whereas you and I are, well, we're probably more on the midpoint. If you're a typical college student or a little bit older, as I am, I'm just a little bit older than a typical college student, then we might be somewhere midway on the scale of maturity, because there's a lot more scale in front of us to reach, right? And all the entities that have a place on this particular scale are all the same kinds of entities, human persons at a particular point of physical development, at a particular point of human development. And embryos simply are just at an earlier stage in that. We're at a later stage than that. And our wonderful senior citizens in our community are at an even later stage than that. So we're all on the scale, just at different points here. So that's fascinating then. What should this say then about the issue of abortion, or how does this inform the issue of abortion, and how Lee and George both then respond to abortion by arguing that it's immoral, that it is morally wrong and should never be done? They present an answer to that question, by responding to 3 arguments for abortion that are pretty popular. One of the arguments in favor of abortion is what they call the dualist no person argument. I know that's a mouthful, but basically, what this particular argument, or what the person who makes this argument is going to say, is that, okay, I concede your point, Lee and George. Embryos may be humans, and I don't mind saying that they're humans, but they're not persons, in the sense that, they don't have everything that comes with being a full-blown person, because they don't really exercise higher mental capacities like self-awareness or consciousness. Um, this is an interesting kind of argument, because um, part of it seems to have some real validity to it, in the sense that, we tend to think that one of the unique, or very unique features of what it is to be a human is to actually be conscious, because there's really no other kind of creature that can be conscious in the way that human beings can be. Let me give you an example. I mean, I have a wonderful dog. I love my dog. She is amazing. My dog is very aware of the birds that hang out in the yard, and the armadillos that run around at night. She picks up on those pretty quick. She's very aware of that, but she's not aware of herself, right? She's not aware of her awareness. She doesn't have an awareness of her ability to be aware. Okay? This is what we mean by self-awareness, or consciousness. It's that I can take both a first person perspective on myself and a third person perspective on myself, and I can take a third person perspective of my first person perspective on myself, right? I don't mean to make your brain hurt, but this is what we're able to do. It's amazing, the intelligence that we have compared to other kinds of creatures in the world. And so, because it's so unique to us, oftentimes people will throw that out there, and for good reason. It's something that needs to be thought about, that our ability to have an awareness of our awareness is so unique. Surely that has something then to say about what it is to be a human person. Surely that's an important ingredient as to personhood itself. I mean, even and forgive the example here. Um, Even someone who's in a coma is a human, but at that point in time, especially if if they're in a coma for several years, surely they're not a person, right? In the full sense, because they're not aware of anything. They're in a coma, and so there's something almost less than human, or less than being a full bore, full blown, robust human in that sense. Well, here's how Lee and George respond to this argument. They say that this argument is very flawed because what it assumes, and this is the dualist part of the argument, what it assumes is that what the person is consciousness. Person is not their body, but all that the person is their consciousness that simply inhabits a body. I'll give you a really good example of that. In the 16th, 17th century, there was an incredibly important philosopher, has been very influential um, even to this day. His name is Descartes, and he argued that the only thing that he could know with certainty is that he existed. And the reason why that was the only thing he could know with certainty is because he could never really rule out whether or not people were deceiving him about himself. He's like, I think that I'm, sitting here in my chair hanging out by the fireplace. I think that I have hands and feet and arms and legs and a head and a stomach. Uh, and if he was from here in Alabama, chicken and dumplings and peach cobbler and all that good stuff. I think that this stuff exists, but sometimes my senses deceive me, even about myself. Right? My senses can be deceived by all kinds of things, by drugs and by optical illusions, um, and by things that maybe taste like chocolate, but they're not really chocolate. Maybe it's just coffee that has an affinity to tasting like chocolate, or whatever. Right? Our senses can deceive us so much. So I can never really know with certainty anything about my body, but I can know with certainty that I exist because my mind makes that possible. So Descartes came to this conclusion. The only thing I can really be sure about is that I am a mind, and thus I have a body, because I can't be sure about the body itself. So the real me isn't so much my body as it is my mind. And if I have a body, it's just that I have a body. My identity is to be understood as being my mind. The real me is my consciousness, it's my mind. And my body is just like a vehicle that I get into and that I use. So I use my body, I am not my body. Well, Lee and George are rejecting this sort of classical dualist understanding of the self, that the self really is a soul or it's a mind, and it uses or inhabits a body. They reject that. What they say is no, we are a concrete, living, bodily entity. We are essentially a physical entity. We are flesh and blood, brain, body, the whole works, and we come into existence at conception. Embryology says nothing about something called a mind or a soul or whatever. Right? What the human essentially is a concrete physical body. That's the best we've got to work with here. That's what the human person is. The second argument that they consider and then respond to, and again ultimately reject, is an argument that takes some of its cues from the previous one. And this argument is what they call the evaluative no person argument. And pretty much what this argument does is it takes a weaker form of the previous argument, and it makes the claim, then the concession that, okay, Lee and George, yeah, we take your point. Indeed, the best we can do is at least empirically, medically, scientifically, is talk about ourselves and believe that what we are concrete, physical, material bodies, material entities, and we come into existence at conception, when the egg from the spermatozoa and I'm sorry, from the egg from the female and the spermatozoa of the male collide. The egg then is fertilized, and it begins the process of zygote and embryo and fetus over time, anyway. So that's what we are. So we come into existence then. But what this person is going to say is that, however, we become the kind of things that can actually have rights after developing the capacity for self-awareness, or after developing our capacity for consciousness. In other words, it doesn't really make any sense that we have any kinds of rights, whether legal rights, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, unless we could actually be aware of those rights and exercise them. But even more fundamentally than that, right? The right even to life itself, that we really uh, that the right to life makes no sense. Any kind of right makes no sense unless we can be aware of ourselves and thus really sort of exhibit a robust notion of personhood through exercising self-consciousness. In this way, then, personhood is an attribute or it's a characteristic of a human being. Um, So personhood, which on this particular conception means bearing rights or having rights, um, intrinsically having these rights because of self-awareness, is something that could come and go, just like being a basketball player is something that can come and go. When I was a kid, I used to love to play basketball. And I think a lot of the reason for that was, growing up in Detroit, Michigan, as I did in the late 80s. Uh, we had a fantastic basketball team in Detroit back then with Isaiah Thomas and Bill Lambier, um, John Sally. We had Dennis Rodman there for a while. Anyway, I could go on, but those were great years for basketball in Detroit, Michigan. I'll tell you that. Well, I used to be a basketball player. Used to like to shoot them, like Zeke used to like to shoot them. I'm talking about Isaiah Thomas, the big arching uh, three pointers that went way up there in order to get some velocity on them, to get some distance on them. Uh, Not no more. So I used to be, but I'm really not anymore. And so someone who holds this argument looks at personhood the same way. That personhood is something that indeed could come with you and be with you, be said about you once you develop self-awareness. But then you have the rights that come along with that. But let's say later in life, let's say maybe um, tragically you develop Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia or what have you, and you no longer really become aware of your awareness anymore. You lose the ability to do that. All you are is just aware of your surroundings and not of yourself. Um, then the argument would be that then you've lost or you no longer are a person. So it would just come and go like all kinds of other things come and go. Well, here's how Lee and George respond to that argument. What they say is that this evaluative, no person argument, whatever it is, that this doesn't appreciate that not all rights are the same. Okay? Some indeed will vary with place and time. Think about voting, for instance. Um, it is not um, a absolute universal right that you can vote anywhere at any time you want to. We know that because there are only certain days and a window of time on those certain days when voting takes place in our communities. Furthermore, you are assigned to a specific precinct location to vote. You can't just go anywhere you want to vote on election day. You've got to go to that particular place. So some rights, namely the right to vote, indeed is very indexed. It varies given certain times and certain places where you are at or where your residence is. However, other kinds of rights, like basic human rights, don't vary um, with time and place. It doesn't matter what time it is or where you are at in the universe. Right? You have basic human rights that are absolute and universal all the time. What Lee and George then want to say is that being or having a right to life, then having a very fundamental basic right to life entails that you're the kind of entity then that can have any kind of rights to begin with, because something like the right to life is so fundamental, and something like having the right to life is going to be so basic to the kind of thing that can even have that kind of right. What this suggests then is that anything that can have the right to life does have the right to life. It doesn't come and go like being a basketball player or a musician comes and goes. Maybe you're a pianist or have taken some guitar lessons or something like that, and you really enjoy doing that, and as I have in my past, and then end up getting a real job and uh, get married and get busy. And I'm not so much of the musician or the basketball player anymore like I used to be in the past, right? Such is life, as they say. Well, um, those things come and go. Having a right to life doesn't. Having a right to life then entails that I am the kind of thing that can have that, and thus does have it, because it undergirds and it grounds all other rights that I might have. So here's a thought, even in response to all this. Then, if Leah and George are wrong, and if having the right to life does indeed come and go, and it's not fundamental to being the kind of thing that I am, then what about when I go to sleep? Do I no longer have the right to life because I'm asleep and thus I'm not aware of my awareness? Or if I was to slip off into a coma, then would that mean that I no longer have the right to life because I'm no longer aware of my awareness? Would I no longer have the right even to medical care, right? Something that would be based in my right to life if I'm not aware of my awareness. And so what people are doing by keeping me alive and fed and sustained while I'm in this coma is that they are keeping alive and keeping comfortable an entity that is non-human, that is subhuman. I think a lot of us are recoiling to this idea that like no, this isn't right. And that's what Lee and George are kind of betting on here. They're betting on you recoiling from these kinds of ideas that you are subhuman or less than human if you are asleep or if you are in a coma or anything like that, or if you have Alzheimer's or in dementia, anything like that. So the third and final argument that they respond to then is this argument that claims that what abortion is a just killing. Okay, so what they're responding here to basically is the position put forward by Judith Jarvis Thompson, in her famous, excuse me, in her famous 1971 article, "A Defense of Abortion." And basically, what the argument there says is that in the case um, where abortions are done, they're not intended for the ultimate purpose of the killing itself. In other words, the point of the abortion is not simply just to kill, but rather it's a decision to not allow the fetus the use of its mother's body, which it doesn't have a right to. So think about Thompson's examples uh, of pregnancies that occur without the mother's consent. In other words, she was maybe using conception or contraception and explicitly not wanting a pregnancy to happen, or implicitly not wanting it to happen when she engaged in sexual intercourse. Right? Thompson thinks that those are two very different things, that consenting to one is not consenting to the other. In other words, she thinks it's perfectly fine to say that someone can consent to sexual intercourse and not consent to pregnancy. And even though they get pregnant as a result of the sexual intercourse, they have not given their consent or volunteer for pregnancy. And that means that that fetus does not have the right against its mother to use its mother's body. Okay. And in those cases, then abortion would be a just killing. It's okay to kill in that essence. Just like it would be if somebody were to plug up to us and use our bodies for their benefit. Otherwise, they would die if they didn't use our bodies. We would think that, of course, I could unplug your body from mine, right? You can't use my kidneys without my consent. And we would think that just like that, it would be wrong, or it wouldn't be wrong to unplug, even though it killed them. It would be it would be a just killing in that instance. What does this view base itself on? Lee and George think that there is a fundamental argument here going on, and what they're calling it is the bodily rights argument. Okay, bodily rights argument. I think in the future slides here, I've got it just uh, listed out, BRA. Okay, the bodily rights argument. Basically, a woman is not morally required to allow a fetus the use of its body. As Thompson puts it, well, a woman would be morally required if she voluntarily consented to the pregnancy. In other words, mom can't consent to pregnancy and then 5, 6 months down the road change her mind on it, go back on her consent there. That would be unfair. Just like if it would be unfair if I allowed somebody to use my body in order for them to survive, right? They needed to plug up to me to use my kidneys because their kidneys aren't working. And they're interviewing a bunch of people and they interview me and I say, yeah, that's fine. We can plug in. I'll let you plug in for 9 months. That'll get you back on your feet. And then 6 months down the road say, nope, I'm tired of it. I unplug and they die. Well, that'd be incredibly unfair to that person who needed me and whom I promised, I consented to at the very beginning. So it would be with pregnancy, according to Thompson. So the idea here is that if you don't consent, if a woman does not consent to being pregnant and a pregnancy occurs, then mother is not responsible morally to to that fetus. Abortion is permissible. Well, how do Lee and George respond to this famous and important argument in the literature by Judith Jarvis Thompson? Well, they do some really important analysis here, and I think that this is kind of helpful to understand the issues that are going on. They point out that, we have to understand that in some cases, um, abortions happen because they are an unintended yet foreseeable side effect. Now, what do they mean by that? That abortions themselves are unintended, uh, an unintended side effect that could possibly happen, um, uh, but it's not what you actually are intending to do. Taking an example where, and this is something that happens every once in a while, where in the midst of the pregnancy itself, in some of the maybe even the later stages or later term in the pregnancy, doctors discover that there's a cancerous tumor in the uterus alongside the child or alongside the fetus. And so what are they going to do? Well, they want to go in and they want to remove this tumor, right? This is a very problematic thing both for the unborn child as well as for the mother herself. So they go in and they take the tumor out. Now, sometimes the surgery itself will indeed cause the side effect of the child being aborted. It's unintended, but you knew it was a possibility and it could happen. So the side effect of the surgery itself then would be the death of the fetus, even though the goal of the whole thing, right, was to heal. So in some cases, there is this kind of thing that's going on. But the reason why Lee and George raise that possibility is because they want us to understand that in the history and in the records of abortions that take place, and frankly, as a procedure itself, as it's taught and how it's practiced, these are incredibly rare, right? An abortion itself is usually considered unsuccessful if the child lives, if the fetus lives, okay? Um, a successful abortion is defined as one where the fetus or the child dies, where the fetus or the child is killed, right? That's their point here. And thus, in most cases, the vast majority of most cases, abortions are the intended expelling of the human fetus from the womb. Okay? The intent here is to indeed get rid of, to cease the life of the human fetus. That's what's intended. That's what is desired to obtain, the goal to be obtained in the procedure itself. So here's a question now. Does this mean that every case of causing death as a side effect is morally legitimate? So they've introduced this idea here, right? They've introduced this idea that sometimes death is a foreseeable side effect. So if for some reason you don't, or if for some reason, right, you achieve that side effect even though it's not what you intended, is that to suggest that every time death is a mere side effect, that it's okay because it's not really what you wanted to begin with. It just happened to be a side effect consequence. And of course, no, they don't think that at all. Consider this example that they give. What if you were a heavy smoker and you smoked for years? I mean, we're not talking about Pall Mall extra lights here, folks. We're talking about cowboy killers. We're talking about, Marlboro Reds. We're talking about even cutting the filter off of them and just getting all that stuff in you can get. I mean, so just think about that person, right? Right now, I've got a great uncle in mind right now as I'm thinking about this, right? Think about that person. You smoke that stuff, right? 2 packs a day for 20 years around, or let's just say 10 years, okay? Maybe that'll pump our intuitions a little bit better. From the time that your son or daughter is born to the time they're 10 years old, you smoke that stuff around them. And the problem, however, is that they have a severe case of COPD, okay? Chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, right? Their lungs don't work well. They have a hard time getting air and metabolizing oxygen to be spread throughout their body from the air that they get, right? This is a problem. This is a problem that they have. And your heavy smoking around them of them cowboy killers isn't helping them whatsoever. So here's the question. Should you quit smoking even though the child's eventual death would merely be a side effect of your smoking? Well, what do you think? I mean, it seems pretty obvious just on the face of it that what our intuitions are screaming at us is yes, right? You're hurting this child, right? This is causing pain to this child, right? Um, Not as though you're smoking in order to kill your child. That's not the intent. Your intent to smoke is, well, whatever pleasure I guess you get from smoking. So should you quit? Absolutely. Even though the child's death, which is going to result from your smoking, would merely be a side effect of your smoking, we still think that, and our intuitions are screaming at us as being yes, you should quit smoking. You should not smoke around this child. You should just cut it out altogether. Now, why do we think that? Lee and George argue that the reason why we think that is because of a really important point that we think regarding the relationship between parents and children. And what it is that parents have special responsibilities to children, and that the special responsibilities that parents have to children are absolute, and they're ultimate, and they're universal, and they are objective, and that no matter whatever circumstance brings it about that a parent has a child, no matter what the context is, no matter what the particular details are, those parents are responsible to those children. End of story. Proponents of the bodily rights argument, however, people like Thompson, would seemingly deny that there are anything like an absolute universal special responsibility that a parent has to a child, that a mother has to a child, unless that mother has voluntarily assumed it to begin with. That is, um, unless mom intentionally consented to taking on that responsibility to begin with. If mom hasn't taken on that responsibility, consented to it, that is, if any parent has not consented to the responsibility of this life that they are bringing into the world, then for people like Thompson, they aren't responsible to that person. They have to volunteer to it. They have to consent to it in order to actually have that responsibility. And of course, the other side of responsibility is rights. So for the fetus then to have a right or hold a right to life or hold a right to food or to hold a right to clothing, to hold a right against a parent, that parent's going to have to assume that responsibility to begin with. Well, let's illustrate this a little bit more, Lee and George say. So consider another illustration to sort of pump our intuitions in a different way. Consider that we have a case where mom gets pregnant. She would have gotten an abortion. She doesn't want the child. She doesn't want the pregnancy, but she has no money for an abortion. So she doesn't have the ability to have this done professionally, which would be the healthy way to go about having an abortion. Furthermore, she has tried everything she can to find adopting parents for the child once the child is born. Can't have an abortion then and can't find anybody to adopt this particular child. Well, given the way that the laws are in the particular town where she has the baby and gives birth, they don't allow the abandonment of the child in that case. So what she does is she takes baby home. Now, think about this. She has not voluntarily assumed responsibility nor consented to parental relationship whatsoever here. She tried to get an abortion. She tried to find some adopting parents. She was forced to take this child home with her that she does not want. So she has done everything, right, to show that she does not want to assume responsibility for this child whatsoever. She's done everything she can to try to prove that. So then would this morally legitimize her action, right? Would this make it morally permissible for her then to say, dump the baby in the woods, as Lee and George put it? I mean, she has shown that she does not want the child. She has not consented to it whatsoever. She has been forced against her will to take it home. So why not just throw it out the window of the car, out into the woods, um, and leave it at that? Well, let's go back to the earlier point. What Lee and George are screaming here because they think that you are screaming this also. You're saying, no, you have a special responsibility to this child simply in virtue of being a mother. This is just the way the world is. Mothers have special responsibilities, not because they consent to them, not because they want to, not because they want them, not because other people force them. It's just naturally, absolutely, universally the case that in virtue of having this particular role as mother, whether you signed up for it or not, that you then have a special responsibility of being a mother. And what mothers do not do in light of their responsibilities is dump their children out in the woods to starve and to die. So what do Lee and George say about all this then? Well, arguments like Thompson's, what they're calling the bodily rights argument, what it does, it assumes or it supposes that individual people have a very fundamental or primordial right to construct life as we please. In other words, that we have this ultimate foundational right to design our own lives as we want them. And so consent is a big aspect of that, right? That we only consent to that which fits our plans for the lives that we want to live. And thus, other people have claims on us. They hold rights against us that we have a responsibility to fulfill only if, or only so long, that we actually voluntarily consent to them. But what Lee and George want to say is that this whole bodily rights argument that is sort of the fundamental assumption here to what people like Judith Thompson argue is inherently wrong and inherently problematic. And the reason why it is because we're actually not our own little islands out here in the world, but we are members of communities. We are members of little platoons, as Burke would put it, or we are members of specific societies where we live. That could be anything from a nuclear family, or if not a nuclear family, then just the neighborhood that you live in, the county or town that you live in, the community that you're a part of, however you want to cast that. Whatever community you're a part of, and maybe you're a member of a lot of communities all at once, right? Because all these things overlap. That necessarily entails that you have duties and responsibilities in those communities. You are not your own in that sense. So, situational factors about us, any kind of situational factor about us. You're a student, being in a situation of being a student entails that you have a special responsibility and a duty to others. You've got a duty to the college, for instance, or the school you're at right now, to be a good student and to not break the rules that are part of that situation regarding you. That is that specific situation of being a student. If you're a son or a daughter, you're going to have special responsibilities and duties in virtue of being a son or a daughter, a parent in some way. If you're a citizen of a particular country, that's a situational factor about you that entails certain kinds of responsibilities and duties that you have to other people within the country in which you are a citizen of. And of course, we can go on and on about this. So their point is that abortion is wrong because it takes the life of a human person who is fully intact as a human, and it's denying them a primordial or basic right that they have, that is in being able to flourish and exist and grow up and mature. And thus why arguments like Judith Thompson's fail, right, according to them, according to Lee and George, is because they have because an argument like that is based on a very shallow understanding of the actual rights and responsibilities then that we have to other people in light of the communities in which we live. And that being a parent especially entails a kind of special responsibility that is very unique to that role or to that vocation of being a parent. But nonetheless, it's one that they would say is absolute. It's universal. It doesn't matter whether you like it or not. It doesn't matter whether you want to it or not. It doesn't matter whether you have consented to it or volunteered it or not. If you're a parent, then automatically you are responsible for your children. And ultimately, at the very base level of what your responsibilities are, then as a parent, in virtue of being a parent, surely the very basic one there is to respect the life, the existence um, of the child to whom you are a parent.